let us then we will briefly, as I said, we'll briefly pick up with resistance. And we had talked about formulating a working hypothesis. Since we don't have quite as much time to go through this section, I'm just going to talk verbally, and I'm not going to write notes on the board for this section because I think that will give us the best of both worlds of covering the content in a way that's streamlined, but also not losing it altogether. So our working hypothesis, remember that client response specificity, when we think of client response specificity, what we're thinking about is what relational experience does this client need to change? I'm not going to go into externalizing yet, even though my mind wants to pull me there. And one of the biggest, what we're trying to do when resistance comes up is simply observe it and explore it with a client. So often, clients have the experience of being in a relationship where if they're resistant, they just get crushed. They get yelled at, they get pushed around, they get punished. And in reality, the client's resistance is actually a protective mechanism that's saying like, hey, what resistance is functionally in relationship the same thing that would stop a kid from running out into traffic. Right? So a kid needs to cross the road and they're saying like, whoa, I don't want to go there because I'm just going to get plowed over by a truck, by a car, whatever it might be. And so we want to help the client to recognize, okay, is this a road that's empty that you can actually walk across once looking both ways, or is this a raging highway? Many of the experiences of roads for our clients are just raging highways. So anytime they see a road at all, they become locked up and afraid to proceed. And what we want to do, again, is to help our clients discriminate. When do you need that self-restraint to protect you from getting run over by a truck? And can we help the client to learn, okay, sometimes the road is really busy, but sometimes the road is clear. And when the road is clear, I can move forward. So we're helping the client to trust not the therapist as the person. We're helping the client to trust themselves in their ability to determine whether somebody is trustworthy or not. Who is worthy of these new adaptive ways of coping and who is not. And with resistance, we don't want to wait to start exploring it. It's important that we're not exploring it in an abrasive way, but we want to address resistance during the initial phone call. One of the most effective things we can do as therapists is to have a consultation call with our clients prior to the first session. And I like to do a phone call with my clients before the first session because I think it can really mitigate the amount of anxiety and the build up to the first session. Oftentimes, when something approaches in the future, 2-3 weeks in the future, we anticipate, and we get really nervous. We get really caught up and bogged down. And I find that a phone call with a client, my goal in a phone call is usually kind of two things. I want to give the client an experience of what our therapy sessions are going to be like. And I want to let the client know, give them a little taste for therapy so that they can not project onto the therapy session as much, but that they can actually have an experience of me. Rather than saying, what's the therapist going to be like? What's the first session going to be like? What's therapy going to be like? In this imaginative way, which is going to be filled with horrors and fears, right, of these problematic ways of relating, the client can actually experience, oh, JP was actually pretty easy to talk to, right? Oh, the first session is actually going to be just kind of organically us getting to know each other a little bit. We'll probably cover some administrative things. So I'm kind of laying out, again, this is that role induction, what the client can expect in the first session. And so when we're on the phone with the client, we want to elicit an explicit bid that the client will be at the session. So it's like, okay, we're scheduled for 4 o'clock on Tuesday. Well, I see you then. The client's like, yeah, I think I'm going to make it. That's telling us that there's some resistance there. And so what we do to assess that resistance is we simply say, I hear you saying you'll probably be there. I'm wondering if there's anything that might hold you back. Maybe it's something specific like, well, it's kind of a tight schedule and I don't have enough time to get there, right? anytime we're exploring resistance, first we're validating and exploring reality-based constraints. And then secondly, we're exploring, okay, is there anything that might be intimidating about that session? When I'm talking to clients in the first phone call as well, one of the things at the tail end of the session, of the phone call that I like to ask is, how's it been feeling for us to talk today? Is there anything that you didn't like? Is there anything that felt really uncomfortable? And if the client says, yes, we talk about it and I address it. And if the client says, no, honestly, you're a pretty nice guy, I'm actually really looking forward to it, I always follow up with a second question, which is, if I did something or said something that you didn't like in the future, would you be able to let me know about it? I think therapy works best when we're able to talk straightforwardly about how you and I are interacting so we can clarify misunderstandings. If we had a misunderstanding, would that be something that is easy for you to bring up with me? Or would it be more difficult? And clients will usually say, no, I'll bring it up. It's no problem. I'm pretty straightforward. I'm a pretty straight shooter myself. Or a client would say, yeah, no, that would be really hard. I don't know if I would be able to really let you know if it was a problem. And at that point, I kind of set that as a tentative goal. And I say, okay, well, let's make sure to talk about that in our first few sessions. Maybe that could be a goal of our work together to help you be more assertive with me. And so that first phone call isn't a drawn-out therapy session. It's usually about 15 minutes long. I usually ask, what's bringing you in? What are you hoping to get from therapy? And then I kind of assess resistance. And then I let them know at the end of the phone call as well, like, hey, just so you know, this is pretty much what our sessions will be like. We'll certainly go into more detail and talk a little bit more at length about the things that come up. But the style, the way that we're talking about these things now, this is typically what our sessions will look like moving forward. It's really important that the client is actually accepting responsibility to change. That's why we're trying to get that explicit bid, yes, I'll be there at 4 o'clock. Oftentimes clients are coming in because their boyfriend or girlfriend tells them that they should come in, because their parents are telling them to come in, because they're having this pressure, and they don't actually have the intention to come into therapy. This is one of the focal points of internal focus for change, is that we need to help the client have the choice to be here. And so Tybor actually says that if a client isn't actually ready to commit to therapy, if they're not ready for a first session, it's actually better that the client doesn't come to therapy and waits until they're ready. Because what we don't want is a broken hope. We don't want a client to come to therapy because they feel like they should, and because they feel like they should, they're not really ready to participate, and then they end up not coming back, and it feels like a failure on their part, and then their whole view of therapy is, oh, it's not that helpful. I tried it once, and the first session just didn't really feel great. So we want to give the clients the choice. Well, you can come in right now or not. Another kind of middle ground here is that we can ask the clients, if there is some ambivalence, if there is some resistance, we can say, well, what if we just commit to one session? Let's commit to one session next week just to see if you would like it. And at that session, we can decide whether you want to move forward again. Or maybe we'll just have 2 sessions. And then after 2 sessions, you can let me know whether you really want to do this work, and I'd be happy to join you, or not. And I would respect that decision. That's very, very important. Again, we're in the second part here is we're going to explore the resistance at the end of the first session. This is going to look a lot like the phone call. Yes, listen.
So what about in situations where they don't want to be there, but they have to be there? Like if they're on probation or something like that.
Yes.
How do you make them ready for therapy?
You can't.
Okay.
You would utilize, probably what you'll do is a lot of motivational interviewing. And Tybor talks about motivational interviewing a lot. It's an evidence-based practice, especially for addictions recovery. And what it really focuses on is the internal focus for change. So if a client doesn't want to be there, we want to be able to be talking about that. We want to be honest that we can't force the client to be there, nor can we force the client to care. And we don't really want to try. It'll be very frustrating to us if we think that it's our responsibility to get the client to change. We'll talk about that more in internal focus. But it just requires, typically, if you have a client like that, you'll probably have a pretty big population like that. It's pretty rare to have kind of a one-off. Usually, if you're in a therapeutic role like that, you'll have a lot of people who are maybe involved with the drug court or on probation or something like that. So I think you would have, the short answer is you'll have more training as to how to deal with those clients because it does take a different response than a client who's wanting to be there. But especially important to that is that we don't adopt an authoritarian stance of, well, you have to be there and you have to listen to me, because that's what got this person in the first place. And clearly, if they're in prison, if they're incarcerated, control isn't working. This approach of, well, I'm going to intimidate you into listening to me, it doesn't work. So we need to adopt a different stance. At the end of the first session, we want to ask them how it felt, whether they had any concerns about the treatment process or the therapist, and then we're laying the groundwork for a relationship. Clients typically will not bring up their concerns, their issues, or their difficulties with the therapist. And yet, the research very clearly shows that pretty much every client who has successful therapeutic experience has some aspects of their therapeutic journey of the therapist that they didn't like. And that's a sad thing. I often tell clients in the first session, I say, honestly, something that would make me feel sad is if we went through therapy and you got like a lot of gains from it, but you walked away kind of thinking, yeah, but this thing kind of kept up and I kept coming up in therapy and I just didn't really love that. Or he was really helpful, but sometimes he would talk about things that just sounded more important to him than they felt to me. So my role as a therapist is to give that explicit permission, and when I'm sensing an ambivalence or a hesitation or frustration, to name it and explore that. I actually want to invite the client's criticism. I don't have to be afraid of the client's criticism, because if this is really what I say it is, if this is really a collaboration, then their frustrations and their criticisms of me are of the utmost importance. And then we will explore, okay, how can we remedy that? You'll experience, especially early on, clients who test your adequacy. Here, the key is really that we want to show, don't tell. So one of the things that clients will say to you is, "You're so young. How can you help me?" Right? People say this to me a lot. Maybe not a lot, but certain clients, you'll see certain groups of people that will say it. And we want to show, not tell. We were talking before that one of the challenges of this type of listening, this type of dialogue, is to not try to reassure the client. Right? If a client says to you, "You're just so young, I'm not really sure if you'll be ready to handle my problems." If that makes us anxious about our own adequacy or our own inadequacy, we'll respond by saying, "No, I've had a lot of training, I know what I need to do, like I've actually been through this before," or we'll become very anxious, but that'll be an ineffective response, because what we're doing then is actually playing out the very fears of the client, that we don't actually have a confidence that we can help them. The way we respond to it is to show, don't tell. We say, "Okay, yeah, you're a little bit nervous that I'm young and I might not be able to help you. That would be really scary. It sounds like you're having a lot of problems that are important for you to work through, and to step into therapy right now, it feels like too big of a risk. What might happen? Like if you're thinking that I'm too young here, what might go wrong between us, or what are you afraid might happen?" And there, rather than trying to reassure the client or push that client's uncertainty away, we're just stepping into it with them. We're saying, like, "Sure, it makes sense that you might be a little unsure about me because of my age. That unsureness makes sense to me. What if we had a couple sessions and then we revisited this? And if during these sessions at any time you become concerned about my age, just bring it up and we can talk about it then and there." That is giving the client the experience of a therapist that's confident, not by telling, but simply by showing, by stepping into something with the client. And so one of the other aspects when clients share their concerns about entering into therapy, this is again where we're listening with these points of entry. oftentimes the client's concerns will take you right to the core of their issue, right? When I was working with Olga, right? She was talking about like, I don't know if I want people to see this, right? I don't know if people can really handle this, right? And there's a developmental history there of I had really big feelings and people couldn't show up for me in them. So rather than pushing that away, we just explore, what would happen if people saw this? What would happen if these big feelings come out? And then you can hear the stories there that actually make sense. When resistance shows up in the following sessions, it can show up in these three ways. I think, Paul, maybe you spoke to it. Ruptures, reenactments, and resistance. Ruptures are the misunderstandings that the therapist and the client have that damage the working relationship. We work through these by bringing them up and talking about them. When we're in a reenactment, this is very important, reenactments occur when the interpersonal process between the therapist and the client, when we're repeating the problems that the therapist experiences in their life rather than resolving them. So for example, with a client that might be forced to come into therapy, when we're like, no, you have to do this. You have to do this homework. We are just doing the same thing that the client has experienced from everybody else, and that's actually going to strengthen their frustration. And then resistance occurs when clients aren't totally aware of the mixed feelings that they have. When part of them wants to be in therapy, but another part of them's like, actually, I don't know if I could be here. I don't know if I can really perform in the way that you need me to. And so the 3 steps to exploring resistance is, first of all, we're giving permission. So we're giving that client an educative response. We're telling them, hey, it's okay for you to have contradictory feelings. It's okay and it's normal that there's parts of you that might not want to be here. And then we're telling them, it's actually good for us to talk about this in therapy. Yeah.
Can you repeat what the third one was?
Oh, this is the first one. Permission giving.
No, from the rupture, the
resistance. Resistance occurs when clients are unaware of their mixed feelings. Clients are unaware that parts of them want to be there and parts of them don't want to be there. So the 3 steps are giving permission and welcoming the client's response, saying in therapy we actually talk about these things straightforwardly. Secondly, we want to explore the danger and identify the threat. We're trying to understand, why does this client have a hard time talking about these things? Right? We're not trying to push the threat away. We're just saying like, hey, what is the threat? And then thirdly, and this is the last resort, we might want to tentatively interpret potential reasons for resistance. So at this point, we might postulate, well, it seems like a lot of people in your life have been very invasive emotionally. I wonder if you're afraid that this might happen with us. Now, this is our 3rd step, and the reason that it's our 3rd and last step that we usually want to avoid is because where does the focus shift from when we do that? When we provide an interpretation, how does the focus in the session shift?
It moves from the client sort of explaining and talking about what's going on in their mind and heart, and it goes from becomes the therapist explaining what's going on.
Yes, exactly. So when we provide an interpretation, we take the power, we take the role in the relationship, we take the responsibility. It takes it away from the client. This isn't an outright problem, right? It's not bad. What's problematic is when we as therapists taking the power in difficult spots becomes characteristic of the therapeutic relationship. When it becomes a fixed pattern, when we always go to interpretation, when we always go to problem solving, when we always go to advice giving. What we're doing is we're taking control, right? And this is what happened in the session with Olga, right? There was one point where we were in it. And then I said, what's bringing you in here? What should we talk about today? Let's go to something that feels a little bit safer. And rather than being with her in the resistance, right? Rather than helping her to become more aware of the different things surrounding the situation, I was feeling a little bit antsy. I was feeling like, okay, well, I think I think we're kind of going around in circles. I want to get us somewhere. And I took the power, and it actually kind of disrupted the conversation. Now, I think perhaps if I'm remembering correctly, we came back to that and said, hey, that might not have been that helpful. I realized that I kind of shifted our focus and kind of seemed abrupt, and I'm sorry about that. So don't do that. But shifting to another session here, shame fuels resistance. Our goal is to, with compassion, simply name the shame. Yeah, Michael.
Can I ask a question about the last one?
Absolutely.
Do you think that, kind of like, in some cases, how just schemas play out in the confessional, is
Oh, absolutely.
We're the first psychologists, of course.
Yeah.
Do you think then that priest should kind of learn to categorize and understand that, the third problem there? And I feel like that's characteristic of a lot of direction that they give.
Yeah, I think it depends on your philosophical assumptions about what confession is or what it should be. You know, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of mixing between confession and spiritual direction. And so it depends on what is the role of the priest in confessional. And so I think oftentimes this is what's very frustrating, I think, for priests is you can be like, well, I'm telling you what to do, and you're not doing that, and that's why you're coming back. And so there can be kind of an attempt to control. There are times when providing that control is necessary, but again, when it becomes characteristic of the relationship, the issue there is that the person knows what they're going to get before they even show up. And if they know what they're going to get before they even show up, they're not going to be actually open to repentance, right? To a reconversion, to a shifting, to a changing. This is what we're trying to help the client create when we're facilitating turning inward, an inward conversion, right? A different type of awareness of what's going on, a different type of awareness of how we are participating in it. Yeah. So oftentimes the goal with shame is to name it. As therapists, Nick, you mentioned how important you saw this to be, and I think it's really important too. We as therapists are afraid to approach shame because of our own difficulty with shame. When a client says, "I'm just afraid. I just feel dirty. I feel like damaged goods." Right? What's the kind of typical response of somebody that cares about them? What's going to be the felt response? What are we going to want to do? No, you're not dirty. Oh, you're not shameful. You're so beautiful. You're wonderful. You're powerfully made. You're a son or a daughter of God. Like you're my friend. Like I love you. You're so great, right? And we do this, and this is how these conversations stay on the surface. Because what the person is saying is, I feel here. And what we are behaviorally saying is, you can't feel that because it's wrong, because that's not actually what you are. Rather than, Michael, as you were saying, it's our role to enter into the subjective experience. Oh my gosh, you feel dirty. You feel less than. What a crippling experience. What a powerfully painful experience that at the core of your being you feel that you're flawed. How overarching this must be. How painful. We need to be willing to step inside the shame. Right? Like Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. There's a fourth person in the flames. He didn't whip them out of there. Right? There's a fourth person standing in the flames. And so we likewise need to be willing to go into those places of pain and terror, to be with those who are suffering. So there's a difference between shame and guilt. And I think you will see this distinction made. Different people make the distinction differently at different times and different places, but a very helpful distinction is that shame is about identity and guilt is about behavior. So shame is about the belief that I am bad, or shame is the belief that in some way I am bad. Either I'm flawed or I'm inadequate. Either I'm just bad as I am or in some way I don't measure up. But shame is about the belief that I am bad. Guilt is about the belief that I did something bad. We talked about this a little bit at length of how we learn often to identify ourselves based on our behavior. There's the saying, you are what you repeatedly do. And I think this saying is very, very problematic because you are a human being, period, full stop, right? Now your character is the collection of the things that you do. Your habits, it is the things that you do. But that is different than the very grounds of your being, which is a human person. You are more than the things that you do. Some clients will be more prone to shame. So there's some people who feel ashamed about certain things, you know. So if I put my foot in a mouth in a meeting, or if I say something stupid in class, I can feel like a little twinge of shame. That's a little bit different than somebody who has a kind of core identity of shame. Oftentimes, people who experience severe trauma have a core identity of shame, and this is actually one of the ways that the human mind protects somebody from trauma. If something terrible happens to somebody who's very young, it's much, much, much safer to believe, I deserved this, and that's why I was taken advantage of, than to believe the very people that are supposed to take care of me, protect me, and sustain me, adults, they're unpredictable and dangerous. And sometimes there's people who do bad things to good things. It's a much more threatening world to realize that sometimes people mistreat things that deserve to be treated well. And it's a much safer belief to say, well, this happened because I'm bad. It's a much more simple, easy connection. And so this is why one of the primary symptoms of PTSD is a belief that the victim is responsible. Because what it does is it actually gives a sense of power. And it makes more sense than somebody's willing to do something that's atrocious to a young child. And so when we have this toxic core identity of shame, these dynamics are going to emerge much more often in session. And so by assessing resistance, we'll be able to go to the core of the issue very, very quickly. For some people, that shame results in what we call a shame rage cycle, right? So I can tend to this, that there's times that I can be really defensive, and it's like if my wife says something to me, it's oftentimes when I'm a little bit hungry too, or a lot hungry. My wife says something to me like, did you remember to take the trash out today? And for me, if we slowed it down, what it feels like to me is my shame is being pointed out and articulated of, you have all these failures because you forgot to point out the trash. And that's not what my wife said. My wife's just trying to figure out, like, do we need to take the trash out or not, right? But what I hear is, why are you criticizing and attacking me? What's wrong with you, right? So I feel that shame, and my defensive response can be, you're bad, I'm not bad, what the hell's wrong with you for criticizing me? And so some people protect shame. What I would be trying to do in that situation is, I'm feeling shame, and in order to try to escape that shame, I'm going to grab onto the power of anger and criticism, and I'm going to eschew the shame. I'm going to put the shame on you, and I'm going to say, you're shameful for criticizing me. How dare you? And so that shame rage cycle can be an attempt to eclipse the shame through power. Oftentimes, the other side of this can be the shame anxiety cycle. And so when shame shows up, all of a sudden we just become very, very afraid. That twinge of shame might get touched on. We just become very hesitant, very afraid, very panicked over what might happen next. You'll notice this in sessions where maybe you touch on something, and then all of a sudden the client becomes very panicky, very hypervigilant, very aware. And so finally, one thing that's very important to know is that success in treatment can be threatening for clients. This is very paradoxical to the therapist, because we think, oh, things are going really great. Why would you be ashamed? Why would you have more resistance when things are going really, really well? There's many clients whose successes have been systematically rejected and criticized, right? Maybe their father was always jealous of them. And so somebody brings forward this artistic whatever creation that they made, and it's like, well, that's dumb. Why are you wasting your time with that? You should be doing your homework. And if this becomes characteristic of the relationship, what the client learns is that when I succeed, I get punished. And so when the client begins succeeding in therapy, all of a sudden they begin to think, oh no, like I'm getting punished. Another way that this can play out is that if the goal in therapy is to help the client with their problems, once the client's helped with their problems, therapy ends. And so for some clients who have real dependent streaks, especially clients who have a borderline style of interacting, which is kind of like come close, go away, and borderline style of relating is characterized by the pervasive fear of abandonment. For a client who's afraid of abandonment, my success in therapy equals abandonment from the therapist. Because if I succeed in therapy, if I meet all of our goals, the therapist is going to kick me out because I won't need to be there anymore. So what at one session might feel like a real big success, next week the client comes in and says, I'm suicidal, I'm falling apart, I just can't do this anymore. And what the client is trying to do is to reestablish the dependence and the closeness with the client. The other aspect of this is that healthy behavior is often incompatible with attachment styles and with the client's schemas. So if a client is, if a female client has always been criticized by their mother for being too slender, right, for being too slim, and there's been this kind of tension there, and whatever, mom always points out how thin the client is. If, say, the client is trying to be healthier and live a healthier lifestyle and lose weight, whatever it might be, if the client actually begins taking care of themselves, that isn't actually allowed in the relationship with mom, right? Because if the client is doing well, mom's jealous of the client. And so the client has learned in the relational style that when I'm healthy, mom cuts me off. So then if this person starts to adopt healthier ways of relating to themselves, essentially what they're doing is they're saying, and this isn't conscious, our role is to help clients to bring it to consciousness. But what happens to the client is, if I'm healthy, I have no relationship with mom. But if I'm unhealthy, well, mom's willing to be there for me. And so we have to realize that our behaviors have much more of an attachment significance than we can often see on the surface. Tiber says that acting in this new successful manner threatens their attachment ties to caregivers who did not support their independence or success and perhaps actively punished it. What we want to do, oftentimes as well, clients can feel selfish, bad, or guilty if, say, there's a lot of dysfunction in their family. Clients can feel bad for actually becoming healthy. They can feel guilty of, like, I feel like I'm leaving my family behind by choosing to act in this healthier way. Our role in that is just to be sensitive, but also we want to support the client's strengths. We don't need to overplay it. But what we want to behaviorally communicate to the client is, hey, just so you know, this is a relationship that when you're strong, we can still be connected. That's a different experience than they've had in the past. So the key takeaway is really that we have to be willing to withstand the shame. We need to avoid reassuring the client, oh, that's not a big deal. No, you look blah, blah, blah. We need to avoid problem solving, minimizing, or we need to avoid interpreting the shame. We need to step inside the shame with the client and say, hey, even when you're feeling all this shame, I can be right here with you. Resistance often serves to protect the clients from their shame, to protect them from all these parts of themselves that they see as unacceptable. Any questions about shame or resistance? Cool. This is very squeaky. So let's get into an internal focus. So the first step in our therapeutic process is collaboration. We want to build the working alliance with the client so that they can have sufficient safety to do the work. And we covered that in chapter 2. But the second stage is the client's journey inward. What we are helping clients to do here is to explore their own role in the problematic situations that they experience. Of course, we're working to do this artfully in a way that's non-blaming and non-critical, but in an open-handed, compassionate way. We want to begin exploring with clients like, hey, could you have done anything differently there? Hey, when mom criticizes you, what happens inside for you? What's your internal reaction? What would be different? If you could say something, what would you want to say? And so the key here is that we cannot change others. We cannot control others. And when we try to change and control others, it actually leaves us feeling disempowered. It leaves us feeling hopeless, and it leaves us feeling despair. Because if we believe that the only way my feelings can change is if you stop treating me this way, we're completely helpless. Because I can't control how you're going to treat me. And this is what we want to help clients to know, and we're going to tell clients this explicitly. Although you can't control other people's actions towards you, what you can do is you can control how you participate and respond in the relationship to those actions. And oftentimes, if we can help you to change the way that you participate and to change the way that you respond in the interactions with the other person, that actually is going to change the interaction as a whole. So we're helping clients to see you can't change other people's behaviors, but you don't need to, because we can give you something that's much more empowering. The response, we can help you to see you can't change what happens to you, but you can change how you respond to it. And that's where empowerment happens. And so we are helping clients to examine how they habitually respond to patterns and problems in their life. We're helping them to evaluate the usefulness of those responses. And then we're seeking to empower and open up opportunities for the client to try new ways of responding. We are seeking to help the client to shift and transition from seeing the source of the resolution of their problems of being in someone else to seeing the source of the resolution of their problems being in themselves. And so we do this in a way always, if you guys were wondering, that should be a 3. What we're doing here is affirming the subjective reality. First of all, the first step, right, we're identifying and exploring. This is a theme that we're going to see through the whole work. So when a client is in experience and they're being mistreated, we actually want to affirm, like, yeah, man, this must feel awful. It must feel so disempowering to be treated that way. First, we're helping the client enter into their subjective experience. And then we explore in all areas of life, both therapeutic and non-therapeutic, empathy has to come before influence. If somebody does not feel that you sufficiently understand their pain, they'll see your solution as futile. So before any attempt to influence, we have to provide empathy. And this is why our first stage of treatment is collaboration. We're trying to help the client to see that we actually do care about their perspective first before we're trying to change anything. And so we're affirming and we're exploring. The validation and empathy has to precede. But this is a pretty good, put this 4 here, pretty good recipe for intervention is to over and over provide empathy and then focus in. Oh, that must have been so difficult for you. What was going through your head when she said that? Oh, that must have been so overwhelming. When that overwhelm strikes, what shows up in your body? We're affirming and then we're turning inward, and that can be done pretty seamlessly. We're trying to help the question we're helping the client ask these questions. How am I contributing here? How could I respond differently? And this is actually what's empowering. When clients more and more recognize their own feelings, when they actually can come to terms with what's happening, so often when clients are criticized, when they're hurt, when they're confused, they don't have the time or space to really know what's going on. So the first thing that we're helping the client to do is to become acquainted with their interior world. And then once they become acquainted with the interior world, we can say, well, how would you prefer that interior world to be? And so it's only when the clients recognize their role in problems that they can realize their power to change it. I love that quote. Only once the clients recognize their role in their problems will they realize their own power to change it. And so there's resistance and reluctance to changing the focus inward. Again, we're going to see that there's this reluctance on the therapist's part and also on the client's part. That should be a little A. So we have, here we'll talk about the therapist, points of entry, and client's reluctance. One of the biggest fears for the therapist's reluctance to channel things inward is our fear of making the clients feel bad. We usually get into this profession because we want to help people feel better. But the ultimate way that we help clients feel better is to be with them. There is no greater validation and testament to the worth of a human being as to pay attention to them wherever they are. And so that means that as therapists, we need to be able to withstand the client's distress. We're not trying to force clients into uncomfortable places, right? I hope you guys saw that in my work with Olga, is that I wasn't trying to push her to go somewhere that she wasn't willing to go. But what I was really trying to communicate is like, hey, wherever you do want to go, I'll be with you. Because I actually care about you. And I care about you more than I care about escaping distress. So frequently we don't learn this growing up. We learn that people only care about us to the extent that it makes them comfortable or it serves them. And when we can be with someone, even in the places of pain, we communicate, hey, I don't mind being in the pain because it means I'm actually being with you. A lot of times as well, we're socialized to just kind of like ignore things, right? It's like, oh, I failed my test today. Oh, well, there's a lot of other grades left in the semester. It's like, oh, I asked someone out and they turned me down. It's like, oh, there's other fish in the sea, right? These things are all true, and they can even be helpful. But again, what's problematic is when these ways of interacting come to characterize the relationship, when it becomes the norm, when somebody can come up to us. What we don't want is somebody to tell us something and then predict what we'll say. It's kind of funny. I was talking to my wife last night, and she said, oh, somebody was telling her about something, and maybe they were wondering what my input might be of like this kind of dynamic between them or what they should do. And oftentimes when my wife is telling me difficulties, my response is pretty much the same, and I say, well, you should tell them that. I say, oh, have you thought about just telling them what you just told me? oftentimes what we need to do, when we go into a conversation and we're saying, man, this thing's happening and I don't know how to deal with it and it's kind of frustrating and I'm just not sure about the relationship. That's the thing that we need to tell the person. We don't need to figure out what we need to tell the person out of that. That's the thing that we need to tell the person. But so my wife, she was joking to me. She said, what I said was, you should probably tell them that. And I kind of laughed, right? But in this same way, we don't want to just become broken records that say the same thing over and over again. We don't want people to know exactly what response they're going to get to us, because that means we're set in a fixed, repetitive behavioral response pattern. And so one of the things that we learn how to do is to avoid these deeper feelings. And therapists are far more effective when they're able to focus on the pain and the intensity and name it rather than trying to escape it or minimize it. Points of entry. Another phrase here that you guys might hear at different places is called different things, but trailheads is another name. IFS uses the name trailheads. And points of entry are these moments in communication where a doorway to a deeper story opens up. Somebody might say something like, yeah, I was feeling overwhelmed, I was feeling kind of scared, and I was feeling sad. Sadness, that's the point of entry. Because they were overwhelmed and they were scared. But they didn't say, I was scared. And I was kind of sad and I was kind of was overwhelmed, I was afraid, and I was scared. And when anybody tells us that thing, that's when we say, hey, let's slow down, scared. What's the significance of scared for you? And that's what we're seeking to listen for. What's the significance in this sentence for you? What's the significance in this story for you? What's the significance in this pattern for you? When we see that, we name it, we bring it to attention. We are effective when we slow down. That's most of what therapy is. Slowing down. And then going to what feels most important. And this is why I think maybe it was you, Felicity, or maybe someone else was asking me, like, hey, how do you keep track of all these different stories? How do you keep track of all these different things? And I kind of said you don't, but that wasn't the full answer. If you can be more concerned with what's happening right now, then you can learn how it relates to the whole story. So if you can really honor the present moment and you can explore with the client, they will tell you how it relates to the whole story. If you're in the present moment, then when the puzzle piece shows up, you'll just see how it fits. And so we do want to be thoughtful to the patterns. We do want to be thoughtful to the different stories, the different vignettes. And certainly didn't mean to say like, oh, you don't need to worry about it, forget it, don't listen to those. I didn't mean to say that. But what I did mean to say is, if you're focusing on the most meaningful thing, the story of coherence will paint itself, because our clients make sense. Their stories make sense. We don't have to work to make sense of them. Now, maybe sometimes with certain people more than others, but as you learn to listen, this is that kind of third ear, you'll start to pick up on things. I want you guys to think for a minute about the listening exercise that we did in class, right? I think many of you were scrambling for, what do I need to say in response? What's the reflection? What's the question that I need to ask? And so these points of entry would come up and then they'd go away, because we're more focused on how am I going to respond to this person than what is this person saying right now. So if we can really tune into the person, these points of entry, you'll learn that they reveal themselves. Effort is the enemy of finding the points of entry. Because when you are trying, you're pulling on a part of your mind that isn't connected to meaning. It's connected to performance. When you let go of the effort and you're simply available to what's happening in front of you, It shows up all on its own, right? This is kind of like you can't try to fall asleep. The harder you try to fall asleep, the longer you'll stay up. But as soon as you let go of the effort, sleep finds you. The same thing with happiness. You can't grab happiness. You can't try to be happy, because happiness is something that emerges when you stop trying. And not stop trying as in this like resignment, this defeat, this despair of, okay, I can never be happy. As soon as you try to grab onto happiness, it disappears. And when you open your fist, it emerges. And so there's this paradox of effort. We need to have enough effort so that we're awake, but too much effort and would become too tight to see the things that are really important to us. So we're trying to find this flow, this relaxation, this space where we're available. And then when something pops up, we see it, we say, whoa, sadness. You've mentioned that word sad 3 times today. And I'm wondering, as you're bringing it in here, like, what does sadness mean to you? Because it sure seems to be showing up. And then we help the clients to connect. They could be the painful feelings, distressing experiences, recurring interpersonal patterns, scenarios. But we can look at these points of entry as doors to the core feelings, doors to the central affect, doors to the characterological affect that pretty much tell the story of the client's whole life. And again, right, in the session with Olga, like we were, in a matter of 3 to 5 minutes, we were there with her core difficulty, her core tension. My need to perform for others cuts me off from myself. And when I need to perform for others, I'm so busy running around trying to do things that I can't feel my feelings. And I can't actually recognize, well, what's the important thing for me to do here? Like we were there pretty quickly. And so with the interpersonal process, when we can track these themes, we don't need to find the themes. We need to listen for when they show up, share them with the client, and if they stick, we explore them together. Yes?
What do you do if you find the point of entry before the client is ready?
How would you mean?
Like if you start talking and like for the client's talking and they mention that word sad a lot, and you're like, oh, what does that word sad mean to you? And they're like, that was too fast. Like if say like you were like you're
yeah.
Oh,
so I would say this.
Right away.
I would say this. If you said that to me, if I said, oh, sad, what does that mean? Go ahead.
You're like, I'm not ready to talk about that.
Oh, yeah. What happens as I ask you about that sadness? I can see you pulling back and feeling a little bit overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
What just happened here?
Mm-hmm.
That's the new point of entry.
Okay.
Yeah, so we name it and we explore it. Now, if over and over and over and over and over again that was happening, we would make a process comment. Right? So we would say, I'm really interested in what's happening to you in your experiences today, but it feels like every time I bring attention to that, we start talking about something else that doesn't feel as important to you. Can we explore together what's happening between us here? We want to have a balance there. Yeah, we're not trying to force people. We're just trying to explore with them. And when we do that, people go on their own. Again, excellent therapists are not gurus who know how to zig and zag and here and there. Excellent therapists are skillful in allowing, in creating the circumstances so that the client can reveal themselves to themselves and can feel the safety to reveal themselves to the other in the here and now. The clients do the work. And if we can do our work, we will create the space so that they can do theirs. And that's when it becomes a joint effort, which is much more meaningful and impactful than us telling them what to do. Then finally, clients' own reluctance to entering into feelings. This typically, it might be because as you said, the client doesn't trust the therapist yet. They might say that. Well, then that's the thing that you should talk about. It might be because they don't feel, if the therapist is trying to initiate that internal focus too soon, the client might feel like, well, you don't actually understand what I just said. I don't want to talk about how I can change until you understand what I just said. So they might be feeling frustrated. But most of all, the client's own reluctance to the inward focus will be because they're afraid that the same unhelpful thing that's happened with other people is going to happen between them and the therapist. So they're afraid of unwanted interpersonal consequences that have happened to them prior in their life. There can also be cultural factors. For example, if clients don't, there may be cultures in which clients don't feel that it's really appropriate to share openly what's going on with them. Or there may be instances where maybe a son is getting yelled at by a dad and the person is telling the therapist that. The therapist might say, oh, what was that like for you? And maybe the kid is like, I was pissed. Like I wanted to punch him in the face, but that might not be an appropriate or culturally appropriate response. And so what the therapist inadvertently is doing is what the therapist is inadvertently doing may be pressuring the client to break a cultural norm that's very deep in their sense of coherence and meaning of the world. And so when these things come up, again, we're just exploring them. We want to listen. Maybe the client's feeling reluctant. We say, hey, I know you were telling me that your dad was yelling at you, and it sounded like there was a lot going on for you inside. But when I asked you about that, I could feel you kind of clam up. I wonder if there's, what would happen if you told me what was actually going on inside? I don't want to pressure you to tell me. But what could go wrong here if you shared what was actually going on internally? So we can honor the differences that our clients experience. And so we're shifting into developing agency. So how do we do this? This is an art. It's a difficult art, and I certainly haven't mastered it yet. But we don't have to be perfect, and we don't have to be experts to be helpful. I was talking to my wife about this, and she was reading, this person kind of has this rule that really all you need is a 10% edge. All you need is a 10% edge in some field of knowledge in order to be helpful to someone. And I think that's a really helpful thing to remember, that we don't have to be perfect, we don't have to be masters, we don't have to be gurus. Because again, what we're learning to be experts in is actually joining the client rather than being the expert with the information. And so there's a lot of thought clinically that longer forms of therapy create dependence and shorter forms of therapy are more effective because they're less likely to create dependence. But the issue here is that the length of treatment isn't what either fosters dependence or fosters independence. It's the interpersonal process between the therapist and the client, right? And let's look at the greatest example, parents and children. Parents are with their children for 18 years on average, maybe here in the States, in that kind of direct way before the children go off on their own. Yet some children, after 18 years, are very independent in a healthy way and have this kind of sense of self-agency. Some children are counter-dependent, so they have such an identity in not being connected to others that they're not able to sustain relationships. And some children are dependent, whereas they can't have a sense of self without being connected to other people. So this idea that the length of treatment is what determines or does not determine the creation of dependence isn't true. It's the nature of the therapeutic relationship. It's the nature of the interpersonal process. If you have a short-term approach that's directive and prescriptive, it's going to increase dependence likely. If you have a short-term approach that's completely kind of distant and permissive, it's going to leave the clients hanging. And so whether we're working in a shorter term prescripted manual modality, maybe something like CBT or PE or some other manualized treatment approach that says, hey, we're going to do therapy for 12 sessions, or whether you're working long-term with a client for 12 years, it's not the length of the treatment that's going to determine whether the client grows in a healthy independence or a dependence. It's how we are interacting with the client. We can, what we want to be doing is helping the client to behave in stronger ways with the therapist. In the session, we want to be consistently drawing, welcoming, permitting, and enabling the client to actually act in a stronger way with the therapist. And when we say strong, we mean a healthier client initiative. We want to be encouraging the client to be strong in taking ownership for their treatment. We have to give them permission to follow their interests and actively encourage them to pursue their own agenda. Because when they take the ownership, more change happens. A really simple way to look at this is if you have a project and you're an artist and you have to draw a logo for a company. If you get paid $500, yeah.
Just on that thing about taking ownership, what if the client's main problem is they always feel like they have to take the initiative?
Mm-hmm.
And so wouldn't that kind of like replay their kind of like problem of like why can't other people like start things?
Yeah.
And like why do I always have to start things? Like how would you
Excellent. No, excellent. That's perfect. Yeah, I was working with a young man a while ago and came in after a couple good sessions and said, I'm kind of nervous that I'm just going to be left hanging here. I'm nervous that in therapy I'm actually going to end up having to do all the work myself. And then I said, that wouldn't feel very good for me. And I asked, I said, I wonder if you've been feeling that way in the last couple weeks. And he was like, yeah, kind of. Because I came into therapy and we started working on things and opening up things, and then it's like, then I'm left to walk out the door and it's like, I got all this stuff that I just opened up and I have no idea what to do with it. And I said, I'm really sorry. It sounds like we've been kind of leaving you in a lurch with all this stuff that you haven't been ready to deal with. And one of the things I said to him was, I said, there are some aspects of our work together that you will be responsible for and that actually are on you. I said, but there's other aspects of our work that are on me, and there's other aspects of our work that are shared. I think that we'll work really well together if we can help you to define when is something actually my responsibility so you can know you have to take it. But also, what are the areas that are not your responsibility or are shared responsibility so it doesn't have to be all on you? And the guy said to me, he was like, oh my gosh, that'd be great. Because pretty much everywhere else in my life, it just feels like it's all on me. I can take a few things that I know I'm responsible for, but if everything's on me, it just feels too overwhelming. So per client response specificity, right? What is the relational experience this person needs to change? We're gonna bring one thing to one client and one thing to another. But I realize here too, I'm sorry, we're a couple minutes over time. And so we will pick up with developing agency on Thursday.